This story unfolded in Victorian England during the late 19th century and became one of the most horrifying revelations of criminal deceit and human tragedy of the era. The classified pages of the Bristol Times in Victorian England often carried heart-rending advertisements, but few were as common as this one. Wanted, it read, respectable woman to take young child. Evelina Marmon, a barmaid at the Plough Hotel in Cheltenham, had placed the ad. Just 2 months prior, in January 1896, Evelina had given birth to a baby girl named Doris. The child's father had abandoned them, leaving Evelina with a daughter she adored but could not care for on her own. She had no choice but to have Doris adopted out, as they called it then, so she could keep working. Evelina's hope was to reclaim her child once her financial situation improved. As fate would have it, the advertisement placed right next to Evelina seemed like the answer to her prayers. It read, married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home. Terms, £10. Evelina quickly wrote a response and sent it to the advertiser, Mrs. Harding of Reading. Not long after, Evelina received a response that somewhat eased her conscience. Mrs. Harding seemed like exactly the foster mother she wanted for young Doris. I should be glad to have a dear little baby girl, she wrote. One I could bring up and call my own. We are plain, homely people, in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but for company and home comfort. Myself and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love. Another round of letters followed, in which Mrs. Harding emphasized her commitment to being a devoted mother to the child. She added, "It is just lovely here, healthy and pleasant. There is an orchard opposite our front door." She also assured Evelina that she could visit Doris whenever she pleased. The only issue left to resolve was the matter of payment. Evelina, in her financially strapped situation, had hoped to pay a weekly fee for her daughter's upkeep. However, Mrs. Harding insisted on the full amount of £10 upfront. Eventually, the desperate mother agreed, and a week later, Mrs. Harding arrived in Cheltenham. Evelina was expecting a young or middle-aged woman, so she was surprised when an elderly, heavy-set Mrs. Harding showed up. Nonetheless, the woman seemed affectionate enough as she quickly wrapped little Doris in the warm shawl she'd brought with her. The transaction was completed when Evelina handed over a cardboard box of clothes and the agreed-upon £10. In return, Mrs. Harding gave her a signed receipt. Unable and unwilling to part with her daughter so easily, Evelina accompanied Mrs. Harding on the train as far as Gloucester. There, she stood weeping on the platform as the 5:20 train took her daughter away from her. She returned home a forlorn, broken woman. Unbeknownst to Evelina, she had just fallen victim to one of the most evil schemes to plague Victorian England. The woman to whom she'd entrusted her baby was none other than Amelia Dyer, a heartless brute engaged in the vile practice of baby farming. Amelia Dyer was born in the small village of Pile Marsh, just east of Bristol. Her father, Samuel Hobley, was a master shoemaker, and unlike many of her generation, Amelia and her 4 older siblings grew up in fairly comfortable circumstances. However, all was not well in the family. Amelia's mother suffered from mental illness caused by typhus. She died in 1848, with Amelia nursing her until her death. After her mother's death, Amelia lived with an aunt in Bristol and served an apprenticeship with a corset maker. Her father died in 1859, and not long after, Amelia became estranged from her family. She moved into lodgings on Trinity Street in Bristol. There, she met and later married George Thomas, who was 35 years her senior. A couple of years into their marriage, Amelia decided to train as a nurse, a particularly grueling occupation in Victorian times, but one considered a respectable livelihood. During this time, she met Ellen Dane, a midwife who introduced her to the easy pickings to be made as a baby farmer. Unwed mothers faced severe disadvantages in Victorian England. Fathers of illegitimate children were absolved of any financial obligation, and illegitimacy carried a heavy stigma. Single mothers struggled to gain employment, find accommodation, or even be accepted into workhouses. This dire situation gave rise to an entire industry, a subculture of individuals acting as adoption or fostering agents. For a single upfront payment or a monthly fee, these baby farmers would, theoretically, take over responsibility for an infant's care. Theoretically, because more often than not, the baby received little if any care at all. Many unscrupulous caregivers resorted to starving the children in their custody, either to save money or to deliberately cause death. Difficult or noisy babies were simply kept sedated with a popular sedative of the era, Godfrey's cordial, known colloquially as mother's friend or the quietness. This easily obtained syrup contained opium and was used to lull children to sleep. Unfortunately, overuse, which was common, suppressed the appetite, leading to death from malnutrition. A doctor would then record the cause of death as a debility from birth or lack of breast milk, and the baby farmer would pocket what remained of the adoption fee. Needless to say, the unscrupulous soon saw the money-making potential in hastening the deaths of their young charges. This was the scheme proposed to Amelia Dyer by her new friend Ellen Dane, who soon had to flee the country with the authorities hot on her trail. Then, in 1869, George Thomas died, leaving Amelia with no income and an infant daughter to care for. Amelia initially provided lodging for expectant single mothers, but she soon realized the much better returns from baby farming. She began running newspaper ads offering to adopt babies for a substantial one-off payment plus adequate clothing for the child. In her advertisements and subsequent meetings with potential clients, she assured them that she was respectable, married, and that she would provide a safe and loving home for the child. This, however, was far from the truth. From her earliest days as a baby farmer, Dyer was neglecting the children in her care, allowing them to succumb to malnutrition. Eventually, she decided that these methods took too much time and ate too deeply into her profits. It was then that she chose to simply murder the children soon after they were handed over to her, enabling her to pocket the entire adoption fee. Even in 19th century England, where infant mortality was as high as 1 in 2 and child welfare a distant priority, Dyer's activities drew attention. In 1879, a doctor became suspicious of the number of child deaths he had been called to certify by Dyer. He alerted the authorities, and Dyer found herself under arrest. Instead of being tried for murder, though, the charge was neglect. Dyer received 6 months of hard labor, a ridiculously lenient sentence in an era when petty theft could result in transportation to the colonies. After her release, Dyer attempted to resume her nursing career, but she soon fell back into the murky world of baby farming. During this time, she had several stints in mental hospitals, allegedly due to suicidal tendencies. However, it was caustically noted later that these episodes conveniently coincided with periods when the police were tightening the net around her criminal activities. Dyer was adept at mimicking psychotic behavior, having nursed her mother through mental disease and having served as a nurse in a psychiatric ward herself. As soon as the pressure from the authorities eased, she always seemed to make a miraculous recovery. In 1890, Dyer again came under the suspicion of the authorities, resulting in an apparent breakdown and a suicide attempt. She survived, and the experience did nothing to deter her from her monstrous trade. Instead, it taught her the folly of involving doctors to issue death certificates. She had also long since learned that to stay ahead of the authorities, and anxious mothers seeking to reclaim their children, she needed to relocate frequently. Over the years, Dyer dodged the police and the inspectors of the newly formed NSPCC, running her baby farming operations from locations in Bristol, Reading, Cardiff, and London, using a number of aliases. In 1893, Dyer was discharged from another committal at Wells Mental Asylum. 2 years later, she moved to Caversham, Berkshire. By this time, she had her 23-year-old daughter Mary and, known as Polly, and Polly's husband Arthur Palmer in tow. She had also acquired an associate, although Jane Granny Smith appears to have been oblivious to Dyer's criminal activities. Her primary role seems to have been to pose as Dyer's mother when meeting with potential clients to present the image of a happy extended family. In January 1896, Dyer took in Evelina Marmon's daughter, Doris. Instead of taking the baby to Reading as she had told Marmon, she went to 76 Mayo Road, Willesden, London, where she was staying with her daughter. Once inside their rented rooms, Dyer searched through a workbox and found some white edging tape used in dressmaking. She wrapped the tape twice around Doris's neck and pulled it tight, holding it for a few seconds before tying it in a knot. Death would not have been instantaneous. Doris would have struggled for breath, her mouth opening and closing as she instinctively fought for life, her limbs eventually going limp as she asphyxiated. Dyer would later chillingly admit, "I used to like to watch them with the tape around their neck, but it was soon all over with them." With the baby dead, the two women wrapped the tiny corpse in a napkin. They sifted through the pitiful bundle of clothes Evelina had sent with her daughter, selecting the best items and setting the rest aside for the pawnbroker. With the £10 Dyer had taken from Evelina, she paid the rent and gave her unwitting landlady a pair of Doris's boots as a present for her little girl. The very next day, April 1, 1896, another infant, 13-month-old Harry Simmons, was brought to Mayo Road in return for a £10 payment. Unable to find a new piece of tape, Dyer removed the tape from Doris's neck and used it to strangle the little boy. The following evening, the two tiny corpses were stuffed into Dyer's carpet bag and weighted down with bricks. She then took the bus to Paddington and the train to Reading. There, she hauled the heavy bag to a footbridge at Caversham Lock, an area she knew well. Under cover of darkness, she forced the bag through the railings and dropped it into the river, walking away fully believing that the bodies would never be discovered. Unbeknownst to Dyer, the net had already begun to close in on her. On March 30, 1896, a bargeman retrieved a package from the Thames at Reading. He was horrified to discover it contained the body of a baby girl, later identified as Helena Fry. The police were promptly notified, and the officer assigned to the case, Detective Constable Anderson, almost immediately found a crucial clue. Attached to the wrapping paper was a label with a barely discernible name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address in Reading. The police visited the address but found that Mrs. Thomas had already fled. However, they were able to track her to the house on Mayo Road, Willesden. Despite locating the suspect's residence, the police had no direct evidence that she had committed any crime. The discarded piece of wrapping paper could have been picked up and used by anyone to conceal the baby's corpse. They decided to place the house under surveillance and set up a sting operation. The officers arranged for a young woman to contact Dyer about adopting out a child. A meeting was scheduled for April 3rd, Good Friday. However, when Dyer opened the door that morning expecting to find her client and another easy payday, she was confronted by four burly detectives instead. As the police entered the house, they were immediately hit by the stench of decomposition, although no human remains were found. Nevertheless, they discovered plenty of other incriminating evidence: white edging tape, telegrams regarding adoption arrangements, pawn tickets for children's clothing, receipts for classified advertisements, and letters from mothers inquiring about the well-being of their children. The police calculated that in just the past few months alone, at least 20 children had been placed into the care of Mrs. Thomas, now revealed to be Amelia Dyer. Extrapolating that rate, they estimated that Dyer might have murdered over 400 children in the 25 years she had been running her baby farming operation. They realized too that they had caught her just in time. Dyer was preparing to abscond to a new address in Somerset. Amelia Dyer was arrested on April 4th and charged with murder, while her son-in-law Arthur Palmer was charged as an accessory. During April, the police had the Thames dragged near where Helena Fry's body had been found. 6 more little corpses were discovered, including those of Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons, Dyer's last known victims. Each baby had been strangled with white tape, prompting Dyer to remark wryly, "You'll know mine by the tape around their necks." Evelina Marmon was located and brought to Reading to identify her daughter's remains. It had been 11 days since she had entrusted Doris to Amelia Dyer. Dyer's trial began at the Old Bailey on May 22, 1896. She entered a guilty plea to a single charge of murder, specifically that of Doris Marmon. This was a customary practice in those days for cases involving multiple murders, as it allowed the Crown to reserve the option to try her on additional charges should she be acquitted. However, there would be no acquittal. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the only defense Dyer could claim was insanity. Her history of being committed to various mental institutions was presented by the defense. Nevertheless, the prosecution successfully argued that these incarcerations coincided suspiciously with periods when Dyer feared her crimes might be exposed. The insanity defense was futile. Given the heinous nature of her crimes, Dyer was never going to be released. The jury took just 4.5 minutes to find her guilty. She was sentenced to death by hanging. During the 3 weeks she spent in the condemned cell, Dyer filled 5 exercise books with what she called her last true and only confession. When the chaplain visited her on the night before her execution and asked if she had anything to confess, she held up the books and said, "Isn't this enough?" Dyer remained quietly confident that her advanced age would earn her a reprieve. However, it never came. At 8 a.m. on Wednesday, June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was led from her cell at Newgate Prison. She was escorted up the stairs to the scaffold by James Billington, the public executioner. He guided her to the trapdoors and placed a hood over her head. The noose was positioned around her neck in much the same way as she had wrapped the edging tape around the throats of her helpless victims. The prison bell had already been tolling for the past 15 minutes and would continue to do so for another 15 after the execution had taken place. Crowds had gathered outside, waiting to see the black flag raised on the prison's flagpole. Billington, known for his efficiency, placed his hand on the lever and opened the trapdoor, sending the cold-blooded killer to her richly deserved death. In the wake of Dyer's execution, new adoption laws were enacted giving local authorities the power to monitor baby farms and to act on abuse. Newspaper advertisements also came under scrutiny to help put an end to the trafficking of infants. However, baby trafficking did not cease. 2 years after Dyer's death, railway workers found a package on a train traveling from Newton Abbot to Plymouth. Inside was a 3-week-old girl, mercifully still alive. She was the daughter of widow Jane Hill, who had paid her Mrs. Stewart £12 to take the infant into care. The baby had then simply been abandoned on the next train. Rumour circulated that the mysterious Mrs. Stewart was none other than Polly Palmer, Amelia Dyer's daughter. This chilling possibility suggested that the legacy of baby farming and its atrocities might have persisted beyond Dyer's death, perpetuated by the next generation.